former Russian Prime Minister calls the intervention in Chechnya a military catastrophe. As Chechen fighters hold Russia's might at bay, public and political disquiet grows in Moscow. The case against Rosemary West, police say they believe it will proceed despite Frederick West's suicide. And Darren Gough puts the fight back into English cricket. Good evening. Recriminations are growing in Moscow over Russia's attempt to put down the rebellion in Chechnya. The former Prime Minister Yegor Gaidar called it a military catastrophe which endangered democracy in Russia itself. But a spokesman for President Yeltsin said the question was not the legitimacy of the operation, but the professionalism of the commanders charged with carrying it out. In Chechnya's capital, Grozny, the Russians have taken heavy casualties to no avail. The Chechens still hold much of the city centre.
Chechen rebels celebrated their success today in keeping control of Grozny's presidential palace, but the Russians have other ideas. We had just started filming at the palace when it came under intense shell fire. Well, we've just pulled back from the presidential palace. We're now about a kilometre away, and as you can hear, there's a massive artillery bombardment of the building going on right now. But every time the Russians go on the offensive, the Chechens hit back. Today we saw more heavy street fighting in the centre of Grozny. It's David against Goliath, and the Chechens, outnumbered and outgunned, have the upper hand purely because of their exceptionally high morale and motivation. The Russians, though, have the advantage of air supremacy, and this afternoon they used it to try and crush rebel resistance in the Chechen countryside. On the ground, the result was death and devastation. When we arrived in the little village of Shali, we found a market had been completely destroyed. The Chechens say as many as 100 people were killed or injured here. But aerial attacks on civilian targets like this are hardly going to win the war for Russia. This man told me that his cousin died in the air raid. The people here, he says, were peaceful. They were poor and just trying to make some money in this market. A few miles away, a simple tractor had been hit. The victims are said to have been a man and a boy. The Russian army are now more than 3 weeks into this war, and they're digging in for a long Caucasian campaign. It took the army of the Tsars decades to suppress the Chechen people. Russia's defense minister has boasted that this time it would need only a few days, but already he's been proved wrong. Ben Brown, BBC News, Chechnya.
Despite President Yeltsin's attempts to win public backing for his Chechen campaign, images of dead Russian soldiers on the streets of Grozny are now reaching Russian television viewers. Tonight, a delegation of Russian members of parliament returned to Moscow from Chechnya and urged the president to halt the assault on Grozny and resume talks with Chechen leaders.
The reality of what's happening in Chechnya is beginning to get through to Russian television viewers. Graphic shots of dead Russian soldiers are now being shown on news bulletins, and public discomfort is growing.
I can't bear to watch the TV anymore. I used to believe in Yeltsin, but now I don't trust him.
I voted for him at the start, but now I realize he is a traitor surrounded by criminals.
Demonstrators were out on the streets of Moscow today, reflecting a new opinion poll which shows that 63% of the population is against the military operation. Many people want the Russian troops to pull out of Chechnya immediately, but they know that's unlikely to happen.
The problem is that the government has gone too far already, and in order to stop fighting, they have at least to record some results to say this was a victory, this was a task of the whole operation, be it just having control over Grozny or anything else. But I'm afraid they would not withdraw before achieving any obvious results in this fighting.
The Boris Yeltsin of today appears stiff and formal and rather unwell, much like one of the old Soviet leaders. The image is in stark contrast to the energetic Yeltsin of 3 years ago, when he climbed onto a tank outside the White House and set Russia on course towards democracy. His critics claim his flirtation with democratic principles is over. They include some of his former close allies, men like the ex-Prime Minister Yegor Gaidar. He says the Chechen operation could be followed by a military takeover in Moscow, and he wants the West to act.
I'm sure that what happens in Chechnya now is far away from being the Russian internal business. This scale of the casualties, this scale of the violations of the human rights should be the international concern.
The cost of the military operation in Chechnya will also have serious consequences. It's not just the future of President Yeltsin which is on the line, it's the whole process of reform in Russia. Diana Goodman, BBC News, Moscow.
Here, lawyers involved in the prosecution of Rosemary West are reviewing her case following the apparent suicide of her husband, Frederick West. The couple had been charged jointly with 9 murders. He was on remand, accused of a total of 12 murders when he was found hanged in his cell on Sunday at Winson Green Prison in Birmingham. Clarence Mitchell reports.
Gloucestershire police admit that Fred West's death has complicated their inquiry, but detectives still believe court proceedings against his wife Rosemary will go ahead as scheduled.
This investigation has been ongoing since before February of last year. It will continue despite the changed circumstances, and whatever action is considered necessary will be taken.
The post-mortem examination of Fred West's body showed that the alleged mass murderer died from cerebral anoxia due to hanging. The media coverage of his apparent suicide has been intense and extensive. Some reports have speculated that many more bodies may have been buried at other sites in and around Gloucestershire. The police have criticised the stories, denying that any further digging for more human remains is about to take place.
I must say that there is considerable surmise, speculation, inaccurate reporting about what allegedly certain people have said, which have caused considerable problems yet again to victims' families.
Rosemary West, facing 9 murder charges, remains in custody at Pucklechurch Remand Centre near Bristol, where, according to the Prison Officers Association, her cell door has been kept open for officers to monitor her constantly. The Crown Prosecution Service is now reviewing the case against Mrs. West in the light of her husband's death. It says lawyers and leading counsel instructed in the case will be meeting as soon as possible, but no conclusions likely in the immediate future. A spokesman for the CPS said that on the evidence available last Friday, there was considered to be a realistic prospect of conviction. But now, given the changed circumstances of Fred West's death, it would have to see whether that was still the situation. Considering the implications could take a week to 10 days. For now, Mrs. West is due to reappear in court in Gloucester again next week, ahead of committal proceedings early next month. Clarence Mitchell, BBC News.
The governor of Everthorpe Jail on Humberside has denied claims by the Prison Officers Association that there weren't enough staff on duty when inmates rioted last night. Tonight, Judge Stephen Tumim, the Chief Inspector of Prisons, described the training of staff to control difficult prisoners as very inadequate.
By the early hours of this morning, prison officers in riot gear had quelled the trouble at Everthorpe, where inmates refused to return to their cells. About 70 ran amok in C and D wings, starting fires, breaking water pipes and damaging furniture. There was no obvious explanation for the riot. The governor dismissed suggestions that it was a response to poor and overcrowded conditions.
Totally inappropriate behaviour when the conditions in Everthorpe as a prison are very reasonable.
He also denied that staffing levels at the jail were too low, as prison officers had claimed.
Our local POA branch approached the governor, and it's not the first approach. They made clear that there was a build-up in tension, made clear there were disruptives, made clear their fears that there would be disturbances, and asked for the staffing levels to be looked at for that day.
For the Director General of the Prison Service, Derek Lewis, the new year has started as the old one ended, fending off criticism over further embarrassment. Still smarting from the fiasco of the Whitemore escape, he's now had to take flak for Fred West's suicide and a riot. Putting the Director General first in the firing line was one result of shifting day-to-day control of jails from the Home Office to the Prison Service Agency. Since then, the Home Secretary has made a distinction between policy and operations, but Labour claim this only sows confusion.
In the past, ministers were responsible for both and accountable for both. What Mr. Howard is doing is actually hiding behind the skirts of an appointed official, Derek Lewis, who is not responsible to Parliament for his day-to-day operation of the prison service. That is Mr. Howard's responsibility, and he ought to face up to his responsibility.
Michael Howard has pointed out that Home Secretaries can't be expected to search every cell or patrol every perimeter fence. Derek Lewis, fielding questions again today about the latest mishap, disagreed with Labour's point over the confusion of roles.
The framework document, which is the constitution of the prison service, makes it very clear that I have responsibility for the day-to-day management of the service, and I'm accountable to the Home Secretary, who remains fully accountable to Parliament. So it's quite appropriate that I should be explaining what happened at Everthorpe and the actions that were taken and the outcome of that.
But for the Liberal Democrats, events at Everthorpe further undermine the positions of Home Secretary and Director General.
Clearly, decisions about staffing levels and levels of supervision have been totally mishandled, and the whole idea of bringing somebody in from private industry to run the prisons and free the Home Secretary of responsibility has failed. They should both go.
Prisons have become a hot issue once again, and further pressure will come later this year, when the jail population is likely to hit a new record. Neil Bennett, BBC News.
And in the past few minutes, reports have been coming in of further trouble at Everthorpe. Police say officers are inside the jail and are dealing with disturbances in 2 wings of the prison. They say it's on a similar scale to last night's violence. The Israeli Foreign Minister Shimon Peres has spoken of his regret at the killing of PLO policemen by the Israeli army in Gaza last night. At talks with Palestinian representatives in Cairo, he said the incident had been caused by a misunderstanding. It has cast a shadow on efforts to settle the quarrel over the extension of Jewish settlements in the occupied territories. 3 policemen died in last night's clash just inside the border of the Gaza Autonomous Area, and Palestinian radicals have been demanding retaliation.
As so often on this troubled progress to peace, a crisis is signalled by a funeral cortege. This time the victims are Palestinians. 3 policemen killed by their supposed peace partners, Israeli troops, in a gun battle, the reason for which is still not clear. Each accuses the other of unprovoked attack. As the men were buried in Gaza, there were grim faces, grim words. The Islamic group Hamas calling on the police to join them in taking revenge on the Israelis. The chief Israeli diplomat Shimon Peres flew to Cairo to meet the peace broker Egypt and to try to patch things up with the Palestinians. But it's a mess. Protests over the core issue of whose land is it are growing, recalling a time before there was a peace deal.
I think the issue of settlements as a whole and land confiscation is going to blow up wide open now. Whether the peace process can sustain it and whether the Israeli political system can accommodate it, these are questions that have to be answered.
The Israeli government has halted a new settlement near Bethlehem, but the Palestinians say that all over the occupied territories, settlers are building in violation of the peace deal. The issue of settlement expansion is now out in the open. The Israeli government can no longer turn a blind eye. Thus, it is much closer to having to face the choice the Palestinians taunt it with, settlements or peace. Alex Brody, BBC News, Jerusalem.
A second attempt will be made later tonight to load sheep and calves onto a cross-channel ferry at Shoreham in Sussex. Last night, animal rights protesters blocked the road to trucks carrying livestock to the port.
For the second day running, animal rights protesters are gathering at the small port of Shoreham, determined to stop a cargo of live sheep and calves being transported to Europe.
Well, I think it's a disgraceful trade. It's inexcusable. I mean, it's not doing any good really to anybody, just a few people who are making money out of it. And I think that we've got to keep the pressure up because the majority of people in this area, in fact, I think in the whole of Britain, do not agree with it.
Come on, cowboy, keep it tight!
Last night there was ugly confrontation as 250 demonstrators surrounded livestock lorries using this port for the first time. In the middle, the police struggled to keep control. Persuasion failed, scuffles broke out, and the lorries were turned back. Only 4 ports now continue to transport live animals after all the major ferry companies pulled out of the trade last year. The RSPCA had run a long campaign exposing the desperate conditions some animals were moved in. Tougher government controls will come into effect later this month, and farmers are incensed at the demonstrations they say threaten a £200 million industry.
The difference between transporting them over a strip of water or down a motorway really shouldn't come into the equation. We're determined that the standards are the very highest, and I very much hope that when that new law comes into force on the 23rd of January, if anybody violates it, then they're prosecuted.
Animal rights groups promised demonstrations at every port for every shipment involved in this trade. Another attempt to export this particular cargo will be made on the midnight tide. Matthew Amariwala, BBC News.
German taxpayers are facing a rise in income tax of 7.5%, pushing tax rates for middle-income earners to 48%. The money is for investment in eastern Germany to remedy years of neglect under the communists. But many in western Germany are unhappy at the continuing high price to be paid for unification. From Frankfurt, our Europe business correspondent Jonathan Charles reports.
For Germany, it's a miserable start to the new year. People here will lose another 7.5% from their pay. It'll mean less to spend in the shops, the solidarity tax needed for investment in eastern Germany. Taxpayers are trying to put a brave front on their suffering.
I also can understand people not to accept it, people who have very low income.
It's a fee to bring East and West together, I think, and it's okay for me.
But a German television satire may be nearer the truth than the polite public face. Its opening titles show the Berlin Wall being rebuilt. In eastern Germany, billions of pounds are being invested to remedy 40 years of communist neglect. But some say it should be funded by cutting other areas of government spending, rather than through more taxes.
I would know of better measures. I believe it was unwise to again use the tax instrument. Germany already is an overtaxed country, and what we do now is overtaxing it even more.
German companies aren't any happier either. They'll have to pay more employment taxes to the government too, making it harder to be competitive.
The cost of labor in Germany is too high. So from that point of view, that tax adds something, and we do not need that there's added something. We need that we bring costs down.
And Germany knows taxes will remain high for years to come, well into the next century. The painful price of unification. Jonathan Charles, BBC News, Frankfurt.
British Telecom is putting up its line rental charges by 4.6%, which is almost double the rate of inflation, from next month. The company says it's been forced to raise prices because it's been losing money on phone lines. But BT is cutting the costs of calls to the United States and Canada. For the first time in 40 years, both houses of the American Congress will formally come under Republican control tomorrow, as the victors in November's election are sworn in. They promised votes to cut government spending and reduce taxes within 100 days. But many are political novices, and there are doubts about whether they can deliver.
Early morning on the misty banks of the Savannah River in the old cotton port of Augusta, Georgia. At the Fort Gordon Army Signals Base, they're preparing to meet their citizen politician.
Delighted to be here, believe me.
Charlie Norwood greets the general and is taken to stand in the lunch line like an ordinary soldier. Tomorrow, Dr. Norwood, a dentist with no political experience, whose ordinariness is a great political asset, becomes Congressman Norwood, sworn in as part of the anti-Clinton tide to cut American government to the bone.
We went through this one time about a king, and I don't like it any better when a federal government starts telling us what to do from the moment we get up until the time we go to bed. Americans are not going to put up with that. We've put up with it a long time, I'm surprised, but what you have seen happen is we just finished our second revolution in this country without firing a shot.
From the grand old southern mansions to the monuments for the Confederate dead, this part of Georgia has distrusted Republicans since the Republican President Abraham Lincoln's troops swept south in the Civil War. But local voters overwhelmingly backed their Republican dentist to kick Washington in the teeth.
I don't like our government at all, sir, to tell you the truth. I might be stupid in my thoughts, but I don't like them, Clinton included. Congress, the whole works.
I've heard one good thing, and that was that they were planning on giving the middle class a tax cut. And if they can do that, then I would appreciate it very much.
And so, as he packs up his Georgia office, Dr. Norwood goes to Washington with the hopes of voters in his ears and fire in his belly. It's difficult to believe, but some of the most vilified members of the old Congress, the so-called Democrat dinosaurs, were once newcomers like Charlie Norwood. The question is whether he will really change Washington, or whether, as often happens, Washington changes him. And on Capitol Hill today, there were the first signs of the revolution to come. Republicans moving in to fill the power vacuum left by another Southerner who came to town amid such fanfare 2 years ago, Bill Clinton. Gavin Esler, BBC News, Washington.
David Coulthard is to be the number 2 driver for the Williams-Renault Formula One motor racing team. 23-year-old Coulthard has been chosen in preference to the former world champion Nigel Mansell. His hopes of driving for one of the bigger teams now appear to rest with McLaren.
David Coulthard's youthful talent has shone out since his sudden switch from test driver to Grand Prix competitor was precipitated by Ayrton Senna's death. A succession of dashing performances, including a second behind teammate Damon Hill in Portugal, confirmed him as the man with the big future. The man with the big past, Nigel Mansell, has discovered that for all his rapport with the fans, there's no room for sentiment, particularly when it costs as much as £1 million a drive. Coulthard is not intimidated by his predecessor's record, but duly respectful of it.
He always drives 110%, and you know, that's an inspiration for me. And you know, hopefully, if I can keep his sort of commitment and develop my own skills, then I can go out and prove not only can I do a good number 2 job, but I'm capable of winning Grand Prix and hopefully one day achieving the World Championship.
For Mansell, the future is now decidedly uncertain. For all his popular appeal, motor racing has tended to keep him at arm's length, and most of the top teams have settled on their drivers for next season. There's a possible opening at McLaren, but as yet, no sign of an offer. If nothing's forthcoming from the Big Four, is this the end of the road for the winner of 31 Grand Prix?
After winning the World Championship for Britain, Mansell wouldn't be satisfied with a second-rate drive. He would want a top team, and if there isn't a top team for him, then he's always said retirement is the other alternative.
Motor racing would certainly miss him. Few others have been able to pack the grandstands as he has. And he'd be going out at the top. Though the Hill and Schumacher championship tangle dominated the final race of last season, it was Mansell who won it. Kevin Geary, BBC News.
Now the cricket, and play is due to resume in the test match in Sydney in 2.5 hours' time, with England having the upper hand. Australia were bowled out for 116, with Darren Gough taking 6 wickets for 49. When rain stopped play, England were 90 for 1 in their second innings, a lead of 283.
Suddenly it looks like a different series. Australia collapsing, almost England-like.
Oh, bowling! He's dragged it back onto the stumps. Malcolm has struck.
The thousands of English supporters here are convinced they found a new saviour. Darren Gough scored a half-century yesterday. Today he took 6 Australian wickets as they barely escaped having to follow on. It was Gough who delivered the final blows, dislodging the stubborn Taylor, and then bowling Fleming first ball. The young Yorkshireman has transformed the entire mood. And when England came into bat, they scored quite freely, making Australia's miserable performance even more of a mystery. What's more, it was Australia now dropping catches.
Can you believe that?
And the frustration clearly showed. Rain stopped play early, but for once Michael Atherton has a team in a position to win, while for Gough it was his best test bowling performance by far.
Oh, brilliant. I said a little prayer. I'm good.
What did you say?
I said thank you. I think I said a lot, man.
There were echoes of the past too in today's game. During the infamous Bodyline series 60 years ago, another young Englishman left his mark on Australia.
Larwood hurtling the ball down at 90 miles an hour. Bert Oldfield was battered from shoulder to toe for nearly 2 hours. Another bumper from Larwood, and the ball crashed into Oldfield's temple.
Now in his 90s, Harold Larwood phoned Gough in the England dressing room directly he'd left the field.
He called me up this evening to say well done, he's proud. I'm only second bowler to get a standing ovation at Sydney in Australia or something. That for me batting, not the bowling.
The weather, as well as Australia, may yet foil England. But at least the outlook for English cricket looks far less grim. Michael Peschart, BBC News, Sydney.
Now back to the second night of disturbances reported at Everthorpe prison. Police say they're dealing with trouble in 2 wings of the jail. I'm joined by Andrew France of BBC Radio Humberside. Andrew, what can you tell us?
I can tell you that the disturbance this evening is confined to 2 wings, Wing A and Wing B in the prison at Everthorpe. I can say that police were called out just around 8 o'clock this morning, this evening. We also know that 3 fire appliances are standing by outside. Police dogs have also been sent to the scene. I've had reports from residents who've called the radio station here. They've heard loud noises coming from inside the prison building. It's unclear how the actual disturbance started tonight, but it began at the same time as the first one last night, just after 8 o'clock.
Andrew France of BBC Radio Humberside, thank you very much. And Everthorpe apart, tonight's main news again. A former Russian Prime Minister has called the military intervention in Chechnya a catastrophe. There's more on Newsnight on BBC 2 at 10:30, but that's all from the newsroom. Good night.